Singapore is a city built for the purpose of free trade. The idea that anyone can buy and sell whatever they like without interference from government has been at the cornerstone of Singapore's success since it was first introduced in the 19th century. By the 1850s, the island had already enjoyed 3 decades of free-flowing trade. There was an international community of wealthy traders and merchants. Few were wealthier than Hu Ah-kay, better known as Whampoa. He could buy and sell almost anything that was needed on the island, and was extremely popular. The British called him the best Chinaman who ever lived.
The kind of people who were getting really rich were the local traders. They were Chinese and they were Arabs and Indians who were operating at what in today's terms we would call small and medium enterprises who could build up. They were not capital intensive anyway. It was quite easy for them to make money. They're not paying taxes. You're not charging them anything for the use of the services made available to them. Of course they made money. For the company, it's quite a different matter.
The East India Company, which ran Singapore, was in financial trouble. Its lucrative Chinese tea trade had collapsed as people in Britain preferred Indian tea, which could be drunk with milk. The company was still obliged to govern the settlement, but it did so very reluctantly.
By the 1850s, the company saw Singapore as a complete burden. It wasn't bringing any profit or interest to the company whatsoever. The private merchants were making a great deal of money. But none of this is getting into the government coffers. There is no money to pay for a good police force, for instance. There's no money to pay for port improvements. But the community wants all of these. They want all of them, but there's no money to pay for them.
Ironically, free trade, which had made Singapore wealthy, generated very little revenue for the running of the island. Since Raffles' time, the flow of goods had never been taxed. The policy had become an article of faith among Singapore's merchants and traders.
There was no import taxes. There was no income tax. There was no company tax. And we human beings had not developed at that point of time the GST, the value added tax. Then where do you get the money to finance your state expenditure?
The company came up with an unusual plan to raise revenue by encouraging vice. The right to supply opium was licensed and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Whoever won the license was then free to sell as much of the drug as they liked, without any restrictions. But the more opium they sold, the more they needed to keep selling, because the company kept pushing up the cost of the license. It was a vicious circle. The company also took a slice of the profits from prostitution. There were 15 men for every 1 woman in Chinatown. Girls were shipped in from Japan to serve as prostitutes.
Chinatown in the mid-19th century was rampant with vice. Behind the windows of the shophouses were opium dens and brothels. The British tolerated these squalid establishments because they generated revenue, which enabled the company to govern Singapore.
But raising money from vice only stored up problems for the company. The opium dens and brothels were run by secret societies, powerful clan-based organizations with complex roots in mainland China.
These secret societies had a grip on the people who were members of the organization. And these were coolies, rickshaw drivers, shopkeepers, and even traders. Now, the British didn't really understand how they operated because they appeared to the British to be very mysterious criminal organizations because of their elaborate rituals of membership. They also threatened law and order in Singapore because of fights between rival gangs and secret societies.
Each secret society demanded the complete loyalty of its members. They were expected to defend the honor of their clan against anyone who interfered with their lucrative business.
We want to thank you for all of your cooperation.
The company officials sought the help of prominent local Chinese businessmen such as Wang Po to control these organizations. But little did they know that these Chinese businessmen themselves were often involved in the running of these organizations. So without knowing it, they had actually tolerated and created a connection between opium, crime, and the Chinese community. And when they knew it, it was too late for them to do anything about it.
The city was developing a reputation for sleaze and vice. It was known locally as Sin Galore, and the company had neither the will nor the way to improve things. When change finally came, it was prompted once more by events thousands of miles away, in Egypt. The Suez Canal was opened in 1869. At a stroke, it transformed the way goods were moved around the world. Before then, ships from Europe would sail around the Cape of Good Hope to reach the Far East. Now they could come directly, through the Suez Canal, across the Indian Ocean, then down the Malacca Straits and past Singapore. The canal cut 5,000 miles off the journey and brought a 50% increase in trade in the first 5 years.
Once the Suez Canal was being used as the normal means of getting through Asia, Singapore had a completely fresh start. It was now seen and recognized, not simply as just the route to China alone, but simply as the port for anybody who's trading in this whole region. And this became increasingly the role of Singapore.
In modern economic jargon, Singapore had become the hub of Southeast Asia. The first port of call for Western ships wanting to operate in the region.
If ship were to come from London and distribute various products, it would be much more economical if you come to a center. And from that center, it will be broken up into smaller parcels and distribute to different parts of Southeast Asia. That is the concept of the hub. As the region gets richer and richer, Singapore was trading with more and more countries, and up to today, Singapore is the 16th biggest trading country in the world. 16th, which is not too bad for a small place.